At 7:24 on Veterans Day, my son held my army dress jacket above the podium at the Virginia War Memorial and told 400 people that his 68-year-old mother had never served a day in uniform. Daniel did not sound angry. He sounded careful, the way financial advisors sound when they are explaining why an elderly client should surrender control. The mayor was there. The State Veterans Council was there. 3 retired generals, 2 television crews, the foundation board, and every donor whose vote could turn a family lie into public history were listening. My son rested one hand on the jacket and lowered his voice. "We are trying to protect her dignity," he said. "Since my father died, grief and age have caused her to confuse his service with her own." Forks stopped against China. A chair creaked near the back wall. The president of the Veterans Council frowned, but he did not interrupt. That silence gave Daniel more power than the microphone did. My place card had been moved from the family table to a small round table beside the kitchen doors. My granddaughter sat near the stage with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the jacket as if she were trying to decide which version of me she was allowed to believe. Daniel lifted it higher. "This belonged to my father," he said. "Mom has been wearing his decorations and telling people they were hers. Tonight is about real service. We should not encourage a painful fantasy." The jacket carried my name on the right breast. Mercer, the same last name my husband had worn. But the shoulders held silver eagles. The lapels carried the insignia of the Army Nurse Corps. My husband had retired as a chief warrant officer in Army aviation. He had never worn either one. Daniel did not know enough about our uniforms to understand the evidence he was displaying. He had the microphone, I had the record. Inside my purse was a certified copy of my official military personnel file, my retirement orders, and an award citation stamped with a raised federal seal. Beside them sat a small archive drive containing the unedited oral history my husband had recorded 6 months before he died. 2 tables behind Daniel sat a man whose blood had once soaked through both of my gloves at a combat support hospital north of Baghdad. My son had no idea who he was. He also did not know that before dessert, the council president would correct my rank into the same microphone. A state investigator would freeze the foundation accounts, and my granddaughter would hear her dead grandfather explain exactly whose jacket her father was holding. I was not silent because I had no answer. I was silent because accusation has to finish speaking before evidence can answer. To understand why my own son believed he could erase 30 years of service in one polite speech, you have to understand what my silence had allowed him to inherit. I met Thomas Mercer in 1982 at Fort Sam Houston when I was a second lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps, and he was a young warrant officer who could identify a helicopter by sound before it cleared the horizon. He was 26, narrow-shouldered, patient, and permanently amused by the fact that I could start an intravenous line in a moving vehicle but could not parallel park without threatening 3 mailboxes. I was 24 and too serious for my own good. Our first conversation took place over burnt coffee in a hospital break room. He asked whether nurses were really officers. I pointed to the gold bar on my uniform and asked whether warrant officers were really pilots. He laughed so hard he spilled coffee on his boots. We married 11 months later in a small chapel with 6 friends, 1 tired chaplain, and a wedding cake that leaned to the left. Thomas kept the plastic bride and groom from the top of that cake for the rest of his life. He stored them in the same cedar box as his flight wings, as if marriage and aviation belonged to the same category of dangerous commitments. Daniel was born 3 years later. People who have never raised a child in a military family sometimes imagine sacrifice as a single dramatic moment. A deployment, a folded flag, a knock on the door. Most of it is smaller. It is a birthday celebrated 4 days early because one parent is leaving. It is a Christmas package opened in February. It is a child learning not to cry when the telephone rings from another time zone, because crying uses minutes that cost money. Thomas and I made one rule. Whenever possible, only one of us would deploy at a time. That rule saved our marriage more than once. It also shaped Daniel's memory in ways I did not understand until much later. His father flew helicopters. Helicopters made noise. They appeared in photographs. They came with wings, helmets, and stories that boys wanted to hear. I worked in hospitals. My service looked like canvas corridors, medication cards, blood on floor tiles, and waking at 3 in the morning because a monitor had changed pitch. I did not tell stories at the dinner table. Patients had trusted me with the worst hours of their lives. I believed those hours belonged to them. So Daniel heard about his father's flights. He heard almost nothing about my wards. I served during the Gulf War, then in Bosnia, and later in Iraq. I spent years moving between stateside hospitals, overseas assignments, command positions, and the ordinary work of keeping people alive after history had already injured them. By the time I retired, I had been a staff nurse, a head nurse, a hospital executive officer, and the chief nurse of a combat support hospital. I had pinned silver eagles onto my shoulders after 27 years in uniform and retired 3 years later as a colonel. Thomas stood beside me during the ceremony. When the general finished speaking, he leaned close and whispered, "Now everyone has to admit you outrank me. You admitted that on our wedding day," I told him. He smiled. I was hoping no one remembered. Daniel attended the ceremony, but he spent most of it answering calls from the investment firm where he had just made partner. He arrived late, left early, and later apologized with a bottle of wine that cost more than my first monthly army paycheck. I told him it was fine. That sentence became one of my worst habits. It was fine when he missed birthdays. It was fine when he introduced me at business dinners as Dad's wife. It was fine when he told friends his father had been the military one in the family. Each mistake seemed too small to correct without sounding vain. That is how erasure usually begins. Not with one great lie, with 100 small corrections no one makes. Thomas never allowed it when he was in the room. "Your mother retired a colonel," he would say. Or ask Evelyn. "She has commanded more people than I ever did." Or when Daniel referred to my time in Iraq as a hospital job, "A hospital in a combat zone is still in a combat zone, son." Thomas did not glorify war. Neither did I. We both knew that medals were summaries written by people who had not heard every scream. But he understood the difference between humility and disappearance. I did not. After retirement, we settled outside Richmond in a brick house with a wide porch, 2 old oak trees, and a dining room. Thomas insisted we would use even though we ate most meals at the kitchen counter. He taught flying safety courses. I volunteered at a veterans clinic and mentored younger nurses. On Sunday mornings, we drank coffee on the porch and argued about the newspaper. Those were the years I thought would last. Then, Thomas developed pancreatic cancer. He treated the diagnosis like a maintenance problem. He made lists. He organized insurance papers. He labeled keys. He recorded an oral history for the Virginia Military Voices Archive because a university historian asked him to preserve his aviation stories. He died 14 months later in our downstairs bedroom while rain tapped against the windows and my hand rested over his. His last clear words were not dramatic. "Do not let Daniel turn me into a statue," he said. I thought he was joking. I told him statues had better posture. He smiled, then closed his eyes. I did not understand the warning until the funeral. Daniel delivered the eulogy. It was beautiful. He spoke about the father who taught him to fish, the pilot who flew wounded soldiers, the husband who loved one woman for 40 years. Then he said, "Dad carried the burden of service so the rest of us could live ordinary lives." People nodded. I sat in the front pew with a folded flag in my lap and felt something inside me tighten. The sentence was wrong. Not cruel. Not yet. Just wrong. I could have corrected it afterward. I could have taken Daniel aside and told him that his father had not carried service alone. Instead, I looked at my son's swollen eyes and decided grief deserved more room than accuracy. That was the first time I gave him my history in exchange for peace. It was not the last. 3 months after the funeral, Daniel proposed a scholarship in his father's name. He came to my house on a Saturday morning carrying a leather portfolio and 2 cups of coffee. Vanessa followed him with a laptop under one arm and sympathy arranged carefully across her face. Vanessa had worked in public relations before she married my son. She understood photographs, donor lists, and the exact tone people use when they want money to feel like remembrance. "We can keep Dad's legacy alive," Daniel said. He opened the portfolio across my kitchen table. The first page showed a proposed logo. A helicopter silhouette crossed a blue horizon above the words Thomas Mercer Flight and Service Foundation. The mission sounded honorable. Scholarships for children of wounded veterans. Emergency grants for military families. Support for students entering aviation maintenance and nursing. Thomas would have liked the nursing part. I contributed $750,000 from his life insurance and retirement benefits. Donors added more. A local defense contractor promised to match the first year of scholarships. Within 18 months, the endowment had passed $2 million. Daniel became executive director. Vanessa handled communications. I served as co-founder and board vice chair, with one important protection written into the bylaws. Any contract involving a family member or family-owned company required my approval and the approval of 2 independent directors. The attorney who drafted the provision called it ordinary governance. Daniel called it unnecessary. I told him good rules protect good people from bad seasons. He smiled and said, "You still sound like a commander." At the time, I believed he meant it affectionately. The first scholarship dinner was held in a hotel ballroom near the James River. Daniel placed Thomas's flight helmet under glass. played a video of old helicopter footage, and introduced me as the woman who stood beside him through every assignment. That was true. It was also incomplete. When the master of ceremonies asked whether I wanted to say a few words, I thanked the donors, congratulated the students, and spoke about the long education that begins after a service member comes home. I did not mention my rank. I did not mention my deployments. I told myself the evening belonged to Thomas. The second year, the printed program described me as a devoted Army spouse and lifelong advocate for military families. I showed the line to Vanessa before the doors opened. "This leaves out my service," I said. She glanced at the page. "It is only a short biography. It says Army spouse as if that was my only connection to the Army." Vanessa lowered her voice. "Evelyn, tonight is about Tom. Listing both careers may confuse the message. I had spent 3 decades giving instructions in rooms where hesitation cost lives. Yet in that hallway, with volunteers carrying centerpieces around us, I let a 38-year-old communications consultant explain why my own biography was inconvenient. "Correct it next year," I said. She smiled. Of course. The next year, the biography was shorter. Daniel's changes came gradually enough that each one could be defended. He moved board meetings from my dining room to the foundation office because we were becoming professional. He stopped sending paper financial packets because digital records were more efficient. He hired Vanessa's company for donor outreach under a monthly consulting contract. When I asked to see competing bids, he said the amount was below the threshold requiring review. It was. Barely. 3 months later, the contract increased. When I objected, Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "Mom, you do not understand modern nonprofit work. I understand related party transactions. This is why younger organizations fail. They get trapped by old rules. Rules do not age out because they become inconvenient." He gave a tired laugh. "You make everything sound like an inspection." The other directors looked down at their tablets. No one supported him openly. No one supported me either. Institutional cowardice rarely announces itself. It clears its throat, checks the clock, and waits for the uncomfortable person to stop speaking. After the meeting, one director touched my arm near the elevator. "You were right," she whispered. "Then say it in the room next time." She looked embarrassed. Daniel is under a lot of pressure. So was I. But pressure had never been accepted as an excuse when I wore a uniform. My granddaughter Anna was 16 then. She had Thomas's dark eyes and my habit of reading the last page of a book first. She spent Wednesday afternoons at my house because Daniel and Vanessa worked late. Anna knew I had been in the Army. She had seen photographs on my study wall and watched me fold a flag correctly at a Memorial Day program. But children believe emphasis as much as fact. Her grandfather's helmet stood under museum lights. My retirement shadow box sat in a hallway at home. His stories were played at banquets. Mine stayed in sealed boxes. One afternoon, Anna found a photograph of me standing outside a field hospital in desert camouflage. I was 45, thinner than I remembered, with dust on my boots and a stethoscope around my neck. "You went to Iraq?" she asked. "Twice." She looked surprised. "Dad said you worked at a hospital in Germany while Grandpa deployed." "I did that too." "Were you in danger?" I could have answered with mortars, mass casualties, and nights when the lights went out while surgeons kept working by portable lamps. Instead, I said, everyone there was in some kind of danger. Anna studied the photograph. "What did you do?" "My job." That answer had once protected patience. Now it protected a lie. She returned the photograph to the shelf. Grandpa talked more about things. He did. Maybe because his stories were better. I smiled, but the words stayed with me after she left. Silence can be dignified. It can also abandon the truth to whoever enjoys talking most. The first open break between Daniel and me came over a building. A retired dentist offered the foundation a small commercial property near downtown Richmond. Daniel wanted to convert it into offices, a museum room for Thomas, and an event space that Vanessa's company would manage. The renovation estimate was $900,000. The foundation did not need a building. We had 3 employees and rented 2 rooms from a veterans organization for less than $30,000 a year. I asked for a feasibility study. Daniel called that delay. I asked for an independent appraisal. Vanessa called that distrust. I asked why her company would receive a 10-year event management contract without competitive bids. Daniel closed the conference room door. Because she built this foundation with me. "No," I said. "She works for it." His face changed. There was a small change. The smile disappeared, but the politeness remained. "You think writing a check made you the founder? I think founding it made me the founder. This exists because of Dad. It exists because I funded it, because donors trusted our family, and because your father's name meant service. None of that gives you permission to treat the endowment like a family account. He stood so quickly his chair rolled into the wall. You always do this. Do what? Make every room answer to you. I looked at him for a long moment. I have not made this room answer to me once. That may be the problem. He left without another word. The building proposal failed because I used my veto. 2 weeks later, the small cuts became organized. Daniel began calling before every board meeting to ask how I was feeling. Vanessa sent articles about memory loss in older adults. A director suggested I consider an honorary role so I could enjoy retirement. Someone changed the password to the online accounting portal. When I requested access, the bookkeeper said Daniel had ordered a security update. When I asked Daniel, he sounded wounded. Mom, why are you creating conflict? I asked for the password. You called Ruth directly. You frightened her. I asked for the password. You need to trust me. Trust is not an accounting control. He sighed as though I were a difficult patient. That tone bothered me more than anger would have. A month later, I fell in my kitchen. I had been standing on a stool, reaching for a serving platter when the leg shifted. I struck my shoulder against the counter and cut the back of my head. Anna found me sitting on the floor, annoyed and bleeding, when she arrived after school. The emergency room gave me 6 stitches. A scan showed no serious injury. The physician told me not to climb on stools. Daniel heard something different. He heard opportunity. Daniel arrived at the emergency room before the doctor finished closing the wound. He stood beside the bed with his coat still on and asked the nurse whether I had lost consciousness. No, I said. The nurse looked at me, then back at him. Her scans are clear. Any confusion? He asked. I know who you are, I told him. Unfortunately. The nurse smiled. Daniel did not. Vanessa drove me home. She insisted on staying the night, though I told her I was capable of sleeping without supervision. Around midnight, I woke with pain in my shoulder and found her standing in the hallway outside my study. What are you doing? I asked. She raised her phone, checking the thermostat. The thermostat is downstairs. For half a second, neither of us moved. Then she smiled. Pain medicine can make people disoriented. I am not disoriented. Of course not. The next morning, my retirement shadow box had shifted on the wall. One corner hung lower than the other. I straightened it and told myself I was being suspicious. That afternoon, Daniel brought a folder. He placed it on my kitchen table beside a bowl of oranges and said, "This is just for emergencies." The first page was a durable power of attorney. The second authorized him to manage financial accounts if 2 physicians found me incapacitated. The third gave him immediate authority to act for me in all foundation matters. I looked up. You said emergencies. It is standard language. It is immediate language. Mom, after the fall, we need a plan. I have a plan. I no longer climb on stools. He pressed his lips together. You are making a joke out of something serious. You are making a transfer of authority out of 6 stitches. His voice softened. That was when I knew the softness was a weapon. I watched Dad decline, he said. I will not watch it happen to you while you deny it. Your father had pancreatic cancer. I reached for a platter. You called me Thomas in the hospital. I remembered the moment. I had been half asleep after a dose of pain medicine. Daniel had leaned over me from the same angle his father often had. I corrected myself immediately. You do not remember how long it took. I remember exactly. He opened his phone and played a video. There I was in the emergency room, eyes closed, a bandage around my head. I heard myself whisper, Thomas, turn off the porch light. Daniel's voice answered, Mom, it is Daniel. The video ended before I said, I know. You looked like your father for a second. I stared at the screen. You recorded me under medication. I was scared. No. You were collecting. His jaw tightened. Collecting what? Something you could use. He pushed the folder toward me. Sign it. I closed the folder and pushed it back. No. The next Wednesday, Anna did not come to my house. She did not answer my first call. She declined the second. At 9 that evening, she sent a message. Dad says, you need rest. I love you. I typed 3 replies and deleted all of them. Finally, I wrote, I love you too. My door is open. For 2 weeks, the door stayed open and Anna did not walk through it. Daniel told the board I was recovering from a head injury. Vanessa sent a message to staff asking them to route all questions through the executive director so I would not be overburdened. The phrase appeared in 3 emails and a donor update. Then the foundation newsletter arrived. The cover showed Thomas beside his helicopter. Inside, a 2-page article described Daniel's plan for the new building. The final paragraph said the foundation was transitioning its aging co-founder into an honorary advisory role following recent health concerns. No vote had taken place. No physician had diagnosed anything. The transition was already being printed. I drove to the foundation office that afternoon. My key no longer worked. Through the glass door, I could see a new display in the lobby. Thomas's flight helmet sat at the center. Beside it hung an enlarged photograph from our retirement years. The original photograph showed both of us on the porch. Thomas wore his flight jacket. I wore my blue Army service uniform. In the enlarged version, the image had been cropped at my shoulder. Only Thomas remained. The receptionist came to the door but did not open it. She spoke through the glass. Mr. Mercer asked that you schedule visits. I am the board vice chair. Her eyes lowered. I am sorry, Colonel. She knew my rank. That made it worse. When I returned home, Anna was sitting on my front steps. For one hopeful second, I thought she had come to apologize for staying away. Then I saw the jacket folded across her knees. My dress jacket. The silver eagles had been removed from the shoulders. My ribbons were gone. Only the nameplate remained. Where did you get that? I asked. Dad found it in Grandpa's cedar box. It was not in your grandfather's box. He said you put your name on it after Grandpa died. The air left my lungs slowly. Anna looked frightened, not accusing. Grandma, did you? No. He said the medals in your study were Grandpa's too. No. Then why does the jacket say Mercer? Because Mercer has been my last name for 42 years. She looked down at the fabric. I sat beside her, though my knees complained against the cold brick. Anna, your grandfather and I both served. Dad said you were a nurse at home. I was an army nurse. I retired a colonel. Why have I never heard anyone call you colonel? The question was fair. I wished it had not been, because I did not require my family to use my rank. Why are there no videos of your ceremonies? There are. Dad said the photos were costumes from a military spouse event. For the first time, I understood the full shape of what Daniel was building. He was not merely minimizing my service. He was converting evidence into symptoms. Every photograph became proof of obsession. Every correction became defensiveness. Every uniform became confusion. I reached for the jacket, and I held it tighter. Dad wants it for the Veterans Day dinner. That jacket belongs to me. He said it belongs in Grandpa's display. Your father is wrong. Tears filled her eyes. I do not know who is lying. She stood before I could answer. I watched my granddaughter carry my uniform to her car as though she were removing a dangerous object from an old woman's house. That was my rock bottom. Not the locked office, not the altered newsletter, not even the power of attorney. It was the sight of a child I loved, holding proof in her hands and being taught not to trust what it said. The following morning, a process server knocked at 8:05. He handed me a thick envelope from the circuit court. Daniel had petitioned for temporary conservatorship over my finances. His filing cited the kitchen fall, the edited hospital video, my increasing fixation on assuming my late husband's military identity, and concerns raised by unnamed foundation staff. Attached was a declaration from Vanessa. She wrote that I had entered the foundation office in an agitated state and demanded access after being relieved of duties for health reasons. The locked door had become evidence against the person locked out. I read the filing twice. Then I walked into the study. My shadow box was gone. So were 2 deployment photographs, my retirement orders, and the cedar case where I kept copies of my award citations. The crooked nail remained in the wall. I stood beneath it for a long time. Then I called Colonel Margaret Sloan, United States Army, retired, former judge advocate, and the only person I knew who could make silence sound like an order. She answered on the second ring. Evelyn, I need a lawyer. Her voice changed immediately. Are you in danger? Yes, I said, but not the kind that leaves bruises. Margaret arrived 40 minutes later wearing a red wool coat and carrying a legal pad. She was 71, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and had once made a 2-star general apologize to a private in writing. She read the court petition at my kitchen table without interrupting. When she finished, she removed her glasses. How much money is in the foundation? About 2.6 million. How much is in your personal estate? Enough to make concern profitable. Good answer. Bad situation. She tapped the declaration with one finger. This is not a family disagreement anymore, I know. No, you know your son is behaving badly. I am telling you something more precise. A lie becomes dangerous when it acquires letterhead. I looked toward the empty space where my shadow box had hung. He took my records. He took copies. Some were originals. Margaret leaned forward. The Army keeps records. Courts keep records. Banks keep records. Archives keep records. Your son is counting on you feeling personally insulted when you need to become professionally inconvenient. I felt the old part of me wake up. The part that did not raise its voice when alarms sounded. The part that checked the patient, checked the line, checked the order, and then moved. What do we do first? I asked. Margaret opened her legal pad. First, we stopped defending your memory at the kitchen table. She wrote one word across the top of the page. Evidence. Margaret moved quickly. By noon, she had filed a response to the conservatorship petition, demanded preservation of every foundation, email, and financial record, and scheduled an independent neuropsychological evaluation with a physician Daniel had never met. By 3, I had requested a certified copy of my official military personnel file and replacement copies of my retirement orders and award citations. At 4:15, Margaret drove me to the bank. Daniel had not yet gained access to my personal accounts, but he had tried. A customer service manager printed a record of 2 failed online attempts to add an authorized user. Both requests had originated from an internet address connected to the foundation office. The name entered was Daniel Mercer. He had not waited for a court. On the drive home, Margaret kept both hands on the wheel and said, "Concern does not usually begin with someone else's password." The medical evaluation lasted nearly 6 hours over 2 days. I repeated lists of words, copied shapes, solved problems, named presidents, recalled stories, sorted cards, and answered questions about grief, sleep, medication, and the difference between a mistake and a pattern. The doctor did not treat me like a defendant or a child. At the end of the second day, he folded his hands. "You show normal age-related changes and significant stress," he said. "I see no evidence of dementia, delusional disorder, or impaired financial judgment." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. "I knew that. I expect you did. Then why does hearing it matter?" "Because someone has tried to make you defend a medical accusation as if it were a moral failing." His written report arrived the next morning. Margaret placed it in a blue binder labeled Capacity. The label did more for my peace of mind than it should have. Facts are comforting when people have spent months turning uncertainty into a weapon. The Army records took longer. While we waited, I began reconstructing my career from what remained. I found old orders in a tax file, copies of officer evaluation reports in a moving box, and a photograph Thomas had mailed to his sister after my promotion to colonel. On the back, in his handwriting, he had written, "Evelyn finally got her eagle. God help the rest of us." Margaret read it and smiled. "Keep that. It is not official evidence. Not everything valuable has to be admissible." 3 days later, the foundation bookkeeper called. Her name was Ruth Caldwell. She was 59, cautious, and usually spoke so quietly that board members leaned forward to hear her. This time, her voice shook. "Colonel Mercer, I think I helped them hurt you. You did not lock the door. I changed the accounting password." "On whose instruction?" "Daniel's. He said the board had approved it." "Did the board approve it?" "No." I looked at Margaret across the table. She began writing. Ruth continued. "There are payments I do not understand. I asked Mr. Mercer for invoices and he told me they were confidential campaign expenses." "How much?" "Altogether, $184,300. "Paid to whom?" There was a pause. "Mercer Legacy Strategies." I knew the name. Vanessa had registered the company 6 months earlier. Ruth emailed copies of the ledger, wire confirmations, and 5 invoices. The invoices described donor research, strategic positioning, brand protection, and executive reputation management. The amounts were round, the descriptions were vague. 2 invoice dates fell on weekends when the foundation office had been closed. 1 payment had been approved using my electronic signature. I had never seen it. Margaret studied the page. "Did you sign this?" "No." "Did you authorize anyone to sign for you?" "No." She circled the signature. "We now have more than a governance dispute." Ruth also forwarded an email chain between Daniel and Vanessa. Most of it was ordinary planning language, seating charts, donor calls, press contacts. Then we reached a message sent 3 days after my kitchen fall. Daniel had written, "The medical angle may be the only way to neutralize Mom's veto before the building vote." Vanessa replied, "Then stop arguing about the numbers, make the issue capacity and legacy. People will choose Tom over conflict." A later message said, "Once she is honorary, the related party restriction no longer matters." Margaret read that sentence twice. They were not hiding the motive from each other, she said. They thought no one else would read it. People become honest in writing when they believe the recipient shares the lie. The financial records explain the urgency. Daniel and Vanessa had personally guaranteed a failed real estate investment outside Charlottesville. Their loan was in default. A judgment could reach their house within months. The proposed foundation building would have created nearly $1 million in renovation work and a 10-year management contract for Vanessa's company. My veto stood between them and money they had already begun to treat as theirs. I expected the discovery to make me angry. Instead, I felt tired. Greed is less impressive when reduced to invoices. The next piece of evidence came from the Virginia Military Voices Archive. Thomas's oral history had been recorded in 3 sessions at our house. The foundation had used short portions in promotional videos, but I had never listened to the full interviews. Hearing his voice after his death still felt like opening a door I might not be able to close. The archivist met Margaret and me in a quiet room lined with gray storage boxes. "We preserve original recordings and edited access copies," she explained. "Your son requested several excerpts last year. Did he receive the full interviews?" Margaret asked. "He received digital copies because he was listed as a family representative." "Did he ask that any portion be excluded?" The archivist turned to her computer. "He provided timestamps for the foundation video. Those selections omitted most references to Colonel Mercer." She looked at me apologetically. "Would you like to hear them?" I stared at the headphones on the table. "No," I said at first. Then I heard Thomas's last warning in my memory. "Do not let Daniel turn me into a statue." "Yes," I said. "Play the original." The recording began with the scrape of a chair, and Thomas complaining that the microphone made him look guilty. I laughed before I could stop myself. Then, the interviewer asked about our marriage. Thomas spoke about deployments, missed holidays, and the strange arithmetic of 2 military careers. He described me studying for graduate school at the kitchen table while Daniel slept, taking command calls during thunderstorms, and returning from Iraq with gray in my hair I had not left with. At one point, the interviewer said, "Your son seems very proud of your service." Thomas was quiet for several seconds. "He is," he said. "But Daniel remembers the noise. Helicopters make noise. His mother's work happened behind canvas and concrete. That does not make it smaller." The archivist glanced at me. I kept listening. Near the end of the final interview, Thomas said something that made Margaret reach for the pause button. "Do not stop it," I told her. Thomas's voice continued. "If anyone tells our family story after I am gone, they need to tell it straight. Evelyn served in Saudi Arabia, Bosnia, and Iraq. She retired a colonel. I flew the aircraft, but she commanded the places people prayed to reach alive. Daniel should never turn me into the only soldier in this house. I would be ashamed of that." The room became very still. I removed the headphones slowly. For 4 years, I had wished for one more conversation with my husband. I had not imagined that the conversation would arrive as evidence against our son. The archivist certified the recording's chain of custody and copied the original interview onto a sealed archive drive. Margaret placed it in a clear evidence sleeve. "That is your dead witness," she said quietly. I did not like the phrase, but it was true. Our living witness found us 2 days later. His name was Luis Ortega. He had been a 19-year-old private first class when a mortar attack sent shrapnel through his thigh and abdomen during my second Iraq deployment. I remembered his blood pressure. I remembered the torn boot. I remembered him gripping my wrist and asking whether his mother knew where he was. I did not remember his adult face. He called after seeing a local article announcing the Veterans Day Gala and Daniel's plan to clarify the Mercer family service record. "Ma'am," he said, "I think your son is about to say something he cannot take back. He already has." Luis was now a physical therapist in Maryland, married, with 2 daughters. He still walked with a slight limp. "You kept me alive long enough for surgery," he said. "The team kept you alive. You held pressure on my leg for 40 minutes while you directed 3 other bays. You were counting?" I counted everything because I thought I was dying. I closed my eyes. Memory returned in fragments. Portable lights. Dust in the entrance. A young medic vomiting behind a partition. Then washing his mouth and returning to work. Luis said, "I kept the casualty card. Your name is on it." That card had traveled with him through 3 hospitals and 19 years of moves. He had it framed. The top line listed his service number and injuries. Near the bottom, beside the time of transfer, my signature appeared in black ink. E. Mercer, LTC, INC, Lieutenant Colonel, Army Nurse Corps. Luis offered to testify at the conservatorship hearing. Margaret asked whether he would attend the gala instead. He did not hesitate. "Tell me where to sit." By then, Daniel knew I had hired counsel. He called on a Sunday evening. For the first time in weeks, his voice held no practiced concern. "You are turning this into a war." "No, I am turning it into a record. You contacted the bookkeeper. She contacted me. You are frightening staff and donors. I have spoken to 1 staff member and no donors. You always cared more about being right than being a mother." The sentence struck where he intended it to. I let the silence remain. Then I said, "Tell me what you mean. You left." "For deployments?" "For everything. Schools, training, command. Dad was the one who showed up." "That is not true. It is how I remember it." There it was. Not the financial motive. the older wound beneath it. I had missed his 8th birthday because an aircraft delay kept me overseas. I had missed a regional baseball final because a soldier's family needed me during a medical crisis. I had accepted a command assignment he begged me not to take because I believed 1 year apart would secure the rest of my career. Thomas and I had made those choices together. Daniel had experienced them alone. I should have listened when you told me what my service cost you, I said. He breathed out sharply, surprised. But you may tell the truth about that cost without inventing a life I did not live. You want everyone to salute you. No, I want you to stop teaching my granddaughter that I am delusional. She deserves stability. She deserves facts. His voice hardened. The board will vote on Veterans Day. After that, you will have no role in the foundation. The bylaws require notice. You received notice. I received a dinner invitation. Then come to dinner. He ended the call. Margaret had listened from across my kitchen table with my permission. When the line went dead, she said, he just invited evidence into the room. The week before, the gala felt less like preparation for a confrontation and more like preparation for surgery. Every item had to be verified. Every person needed a clear role. Every emotional impulse had to be separated from what could actually be proved. Margaret arranged a private meeting with the board chair, Brigadier General Samuel Green, retired. He was 74, broad-shouldered, and had known Thomas professionally for years. He read the neuropsychological report, the foundation ledger, the forged authorization, and the email chain without speaking. When he reached Daniel's sentence about neutralizing my veto, he removed his glasses. I should have asked more questions, he said. You should have interrupted sooner, I replied. His face tightened. You are right. It was the first clean apology I had heard in months. No explanation, no request that I consider his intentions, just the harm and the truth. General Green contacted the board's outside counsel. The outside counsel contacted the bank and the charitable organizations section of the state attorney general's office. An investigator named Helen Brooks reviewed the transfers and agreed to attend the gala without announcing herself. She did not promise arrests. She promised preservation orders, account restrictions, and a formal inquiry. That may sound less dramatic than handcuffs, she told me, but freezing money often tells the truth faster. The certified military file arrived by overnight delivery 2 days before Veterans Day. I opened the envelope at my dining room table. The pages smelled faintly of toner and cardboard. There were assignment orders, promotion orders, deployment records, evaluation reports, award citations, and my retirement document listing 30 years of active federal service. One photograph showed Thomas pinning the colonel's silver eagle onto my shoulder while Daniel stood 3 feet away looking at his phone. Margaret studied the photograph. He was there. Yes. He did not forget. No, I said. He decided forgetting was useful. Anna called that evening. Her voice was careful. Dad says you are bringing lawyers to Grandpa's dinner. I am bringing my attorney. He says you want to destroy the foundation. I am trying to keep the foundation from being used to pay private debts. She was quiet. Is that true? Yes. Are you going to embarrass him in front of everyone? I looked at the certified file spread across the table. I will not embarrass your father. I will answer him. That sounds like the same thing. It is not. Embarrassment is what someone feels when truth reaches a place they expected lies to control. She took a breath that trembled slightly. Did you really serve in Iraq? Yes. Did you really retire a colonel? Yes. Then why would Dad say you did not? That is a question he has to answer. I do not know what to believe. You do not have to choose a person tonight. Choose records. Choose dates. Choose what can be checked. Thomas used to say, I turned family conversations into staff briefings. This time, I did not apologize for it. Veterans Day arrived cold and bright. I spent the morning at home. I polished a pair of black shoes, drank 1 cup of coffee, and walked past the empty nail in my study without touching it. I did not wear a uniform. Daniel had mine. Instead, I wore a dark blue dress, a pearl necklace Thomas had given me on our 30th anniversary, and a small Army Nurse Corps pin on my left lapel. Margaret picked me up at 5:30. The evidence binder rested between us on the back seat. Last chance to handle this privately, she said. He made the accusation public. That was not my question. I watched the city lights pass across the window. If I answer privately, the board may know. The court may know. Daniel may even admit it, but Anna will still have watched a room accept his version of me. Margaret nodded once. Then, public correction is proportional. The memorial hall had been decorated with American flags, white tablecloths, and framed photographs of scholarship recipients. Thomas's portrait stood beside the podium. In it, he was laughing in a flight suit, one hand resting on a helmet. I touched the edge of the frame before the room filled. You warned me, I whispered. A volunteer approached holding place cards. Mrs. Mercer, we had a seating adjustment. She led me away from the front table to the small round table beside the kitchen doors. My card read MRS, Evelyn Mercer. No title, no board position. Across the room, Anna sat between Daniel and Vanessa. Daniel saw me and gave a sad, patient smile meant for witnesses. He had rehearsed that too. By 7 o'clock, nearly 400 guests had taken their seats. General Green sat near the center. Luis Ortega sat 2 tables behind the podium, with the framed casualty card inside a plain black case. Helen Brooks sat beside the Foundation's outside counsel. Ruth Caldwell sat near the aisle, pale but steady. The archive drive remained in my purse. Dinner began. Daniel welcomed the donors and spoke about sacrifice, memory, and protecting the truth of military service. His words were good words. That was what made them dangerous. A lie dressed in virtue enters rooms that ordinary cruelty cannot. At 7:12, he paused beside Thomas's portrait. There is one difficult family matter I need to address, he said. Vanessa lowered her eyes at exactly the right moment. A volunteer brought out my jacket. Daniel held it above the podium. He explained that grief had caused me to take Thomas's uniform, attach rank and decorations that did not belong together, and insist the service history was mine. He called me a devoted spouse. He called me a grieving widow. He called me confused. Then he said the sentence from the opening of my story. We are trying to protect her dignity. The council president frowned, but did not interrupt. My granddaughter stared at the jacket. Daniel continued. Tonight is about real service. We should not encourage a painful fantasy. He announced that after dinner, the board would vote to move me into an honorary role and place all operational authority with him. The lie was not merely being spoken. It was about to be entered into board minutes, donor letters, newspaper coverage, and a court petition. Daniel looked toward my table. Mom, I love you. Please do not make this harder. I stood. My knees reminded me that I was 68. My spine remembered rank. I have 3 questions, I said. Daniel's smile held. This is not the place. You selected the place. A few heads turned toward him. General Green rose halfway from his chair. Mrs. Mercer remains a voting board member, he said. She has the right to respond before any motion concerning her status. Daniel looked at the general, then at the cameras. He could not refuse without appearing afraid. Of course, he said, if this helps her feel heard. Weaponized politeness has one weakness. It assumes the other person will remain polite in the way that protects the lie. I walked toward the stage. No one applauded. No one should have. This was not a performance yet. It was an examination. I stopped below the podium and pointed to the jacket. Daniel, what rank did your father hold when he retired? He hesitated. Chief Warrant Officer. Chief Warrant Officer 4, I said. Correct. What rank insignia is attached to the shoulders of that jacket? He glanced down. I do not know the technical name. General Green spoke from his table. Silver Eagle. Colonel. I nodded. Did your father ever hold the rank of colonel? Daniel's mouth tightened. No. What branch insignia is on the lower lapels? He looked at Vanessa. She did not know either. A retired army nurse near the front said quietly, Army Nurse Corps. The whisper traveled farther than a shout. I looked at my son. Was your father an army nurse? No. Then the jacket does not support your accusation. It contradicts it. Daniel gripped the podium. You put those pieces on Dad's jacket. That is your claim. I turned toward General Green. Sir, may my attorney provide you with a certified personnel file? Margaret was already walking forward. She handed him the first folder. The raised seal caught the light as he opened it. The room waited. General Green read silently at first. Then his eyes moved to me. He stood. For the record, he said, these are certified United States Army documents for Evelyn Ann Mercer, commissioned in the Army Nurse Corps, active federal service, 30 years. Overseas service in Southwest Asia, Bosnia, and Iraq. Retired in the grade of colonel. The room changed. It did not erupt. Mature people rarely change sides with noise. They straighten in their chairs. They stop avoiding someone's eyes. They begin looking at the person who made them complicit. Daniel raised one hand. Those records do not explain why she took Dad's uniform. It is my uniform, I said. You both had the same name. Yes, marriage sometimes causes that. A few people exhaled through their noses, but no one laughed openly. I continued. The inside pocket has a tailor's label. Please read the first name. Daniel froze. He had never checked. General Green stepped to the podium and opened the jacket. A white cloth label had been stitched beneath the lining. Evelyn Mercer. The general held it where Daniel could see. My son looked down. That was the first crack. Then Luis Ortega stood. He carried the black case to the front and opened it on the evidence table Margaret had arranged beside the stage. Inside was a faded casualty card protected under glass. My name is Luis Ortega, he said. I was a private first class in Iraq when shrapnel opened my leg and abdomen. Colonel Mercer was the senior nurse who received me. Daniel stared at him. Louise pointed to the signature near the bottom of the card. That is her name, her rank at the time, and her branch. I kept this because I wanted my daughters to know why I came home. I felt every eye turn toward me. I did not enjoy it. Vindication is not the same as pleasure, Louise continued. She did not tell me she was a hero. She told me to keep talking about my mother so I would stay conscious. She held pressure on my leg while directing the rest of the ward. If your family forgot what she did, that does not mean the men on those litters forgot. Daniel's face had gone pale. Vanessa leaned toward him and whispered something. He shook his head. Then he reached for the microphone. This is becoming emotionally manipulative. One old card does not address her recent mental health. Margaret handed General Green the second folder. He read the physician's conclusion aloud. No dementia, no delusional disorder, no impaired financial judgment. Daniel tried again. Doctors can disagree. Yes, I said. That is why your petition should have contained a doctor instead of your wife. Vanessa's head snapped toward me. The room became still. I reached into my purse and removed the sealed archive drive. This is the unedited oral history Thomas recorded 6 months before he died. The archive has certified the original file and the chain of custody. Daniel received a full copy last year. He selected excerpts for tonight's tribute. General Green looked at Daniel. You heard this recording? Daniel said nothing. The silence answered for him. The audio technician connected the drive. For 1 second, the speakers gave a low hum. Then, Thomas's voice filled the hall. He joked about the microphone. Several old friends smiled through sudden tears. The interviewer asked about our family's service. Thomas said, "People remember the helicopter because it made noise. Evelyn's work happened behind canvas and concrete. That does not make it smaller." Daniel closed his eyes. The recording continued. "If anyone tells our story after I am gone, they need to tell it straight. Evelyn served in Saudi Arabia, Bosnia, and Iraq. She retired a colonel. I flew the aircraft, but she commanded the places people prayed to reach alive. Daniel should never turn me into the only soldier in this house. I would be ashamed of that." No one moved after the recording stopped. My husband had been dead 4 years. Yet in that moment, he was the clearest witness in the room. Anna looked at her father. "Did you know Grandpa said that?" Daniel kept his eyes on the podium. Dad was sick when he recorded it. The cruelty of that answer reached the room before its logic did. Anna stood. "Did you know?" she asked again. He did not answer. She walked away from the family table. My place card sat beside the kitchen doors. Anna picked it up, carried it back across the room, and placed it beside the empty chair next to mine. Then she sat down. That small movement ended more power than any applause could have. Daniel finally looked at me. "You planned this. I prepared for it. You wanted to humiliate me. No, you chose the lie. I chose the room where it would end." Helen Brooks rose from the table beside the board's counsel. "My name is Helen Brooks. I am an investigator with the State Attorney General's Charitable Organizations section." Daniel's hand slipped from the podium. Vanessa whispered, "Daniel, stop talking." Helen identified the transfers to Mercer Legacy Strategies, the forged electronic approval, and the emails tying my supposed incapacity to the building vote. She did not dramatize them. She read dates and amounts. Facts rarely need adjectives when the numbers are large enough. $184,300 was transferred under disputed authorization, she said. The Foundation's bank has restricted outgoing transactions pending formal review. The proposed board vote cannot proceed tonight. Vanessa stood. "I handled communications. Daniel controlled the finances." Ruth Caldwell spoke from the aisle. "The invoices came from your company." Vanessa turned toward her. "You processed them because you sent an approval carrying Colonel Mercer's signature." "I was told she signed." Margaret held up the email chain. "You wrote, 'Make the issue capacity and legacy. People will choose Tom over conflict.'" Vanessa sat down. Daniel looked around the hall for an ally. The board members lowered their eyes. Donors stared at their programs. The council president, who had allowed him to begin, finally walked to the microphone. "I failed to interrupt an accusation that should never have been accepted without evidence," he said. "Colonel Mercer, I apologize. Your full rank and service record will be entered into tonight's official minutes and corrected in all Foundation materials." He turned to Daniel. "You are suspended as executive director, effective immediately, pending investigation." Daniel's face changed again. For months, he had worn concern like a uniform. Now, it no longer fit. He looked at me, not as a son or an executive, but as a man watching control leave the room. "Mom," he said quietly, "please." It was the first honest word he had spoken all evening. I did not answer. Truth had already said enough. The guests did not rush toward me when the program ended. I was grateful. Public correction can become another kind of spectacle if people treat the injured person like the final exhibit. Most simply passed my table, met my eyes, and said, "Colonel," or "I am sorry." A few said nothing at all. General Green ordered the jacket placed in a locked office until it could be returned to me. Margaret took custody of the archive drive and the certified file. Helen Brooks left with copies of the financial records. Daniel walked out through a side door with the board's counsel beside him. Vanessa followed several minutes later, alone. Anna remained in the emptying hall. She held my place card between both hands. "I should have believed you," she said. "You should have checked." Her eyes filled. "That sounds worse." "It is kinder. Belief depends on loyalty. Checking gives you somewhere to stand when people you love disagree." She looked toward the stage where her father had held my uniform. "I carried it away from your house. Yes, I thought I was helping. I know. I am sorry." Her apology named the act. That mattered. I opened my arms, and she stepped into them. Forgiving a granddaughter who had been misled was not the same as trusting the adults who misled her. The distinction became important in the months that followed. The conservatorship hearing took place 9 days later. Daniel sat across the courtroom with a new attorney. Vanessa was not beside him. Margaret submitted the independent medical evaluation, the bank access attempts, the forged foundation approval, and the transcript of Daniel's public accusation. The judge read in silence. Then she looked over her glasses at my son. "Mr. Mercer, concern for an aging parent does not authorize theft of identity, property, or legal capacity." She dismissed the petition. She also ordered Daniel to return every document, photograph, medal, uniform item, key, and electronic file taken from my home. 2 sheriff's deputies supervised the return. The boxes arrived on a rainy Thursday. My shadow box was scratched. 1 ribbon bar had been mounted backward. The silver eagles were loose inside a plastic sandwich bag. I sat at the dining room table and sorted each piece. Anna helped. She did not ask me to make the work easier by pretending it did not hurt. She read every citation before placing it in a new archival sleeve. When she reached the Bronze Star citation, she stopped. "It says, 'Meritorious Service,'" she said, "not valor." "That is correct. So you were not claiming you charged into battle?" "No." "Dad made it sound like you invented combat stories." "I never needed to invent them. I also never needed to make my service more dramatic than it was." She nodded slowly. "That became part of our repair. Not hero worship, accuracy." The state investigation lasted 7 months. An independent audit found additional personal expenses hidden among foundation contracts. The final disputed total was more than $230,000. Some money had paid genuine vendors. Some had covered Daniel and Vanessa's private debts. Some had funded the campaign used to remove me. The irony was difficult to miss. They had used charitable money to convince donors I could not be trusted with charitable money. Daniel eventually pleaded guilty to embezzlement and forgery. He served 16 months in a state facility and was ordered to pay restitution. Vanessa cooperated after the gala. She pleaded guilty to falsifying records, surrendered her claim against the foundation, and entered a restitution agreement. Their marriage ended before Daniel was sentenced. I did not celebrate any of it. A mother can believe consequences are necessary and still grieve the person receiving them. That is one of the harder truths age teaches. Love does not always ask you to prevent pain. Sometimes it asks you to stop preventing accountability. The foundation survived. I could have returned as executive chair and controlled every decision. Some donors expected me to. I refused. The organization did not need another family member confusing legacy with ownership. We appointed an independent board, hired a director with no connection to the Mercer family, required annual outside audits, and prohibited paid contracts with directors or their relatives. The new board offered to rename the foundation after both Thomas and me. I declined that too. Instead, we changed the name to the Quiet Service Foundation. The scholarships expanded to include students entering nursing, rehabilitation, emergency medicine, aviation maintenance, and military family counseling. Thomas's helmet remained in the lobby. My uniform was displayed on the opposite side, not higher, not lower. Between them hung the original porch photograph Daniel had cropped. Both of us were visible. That was enough. Daniel wrote to me during his 6th month in custody. The first letter said he was sorry for the pain. I returned it unanswered. The second said he had made mistakes because he was under financial pressure. I returned that one too. The third arrived nearly a year after the gala. It was 4 pages long. He wrote, "I did not only steal money. I used Dad's memory to erase you. I took one real wound from my childhood and turned it into permission to invent your whole life." I taught Anna to doubt you because I knew losing her trust would make you easier to control. I called it protection because greed sounded ugly when I used its real name. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I agreed to meet him after his release. We met in Margaret's office on a Tuesday morning. No family home, no restaurant, no place where memory could pressure me into pretending we were healed. Daniel looked older than 44. He had lost weight. His hands shook when he removed his coat. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I am sorry I made you prove your life." I looked at him carefully. That is part of it. I am sorry I stole from the foundation. Yes. I am sorry I used Anna. Yes. I am sorry I blamed your service for choices I made as an adult. That was the sentence I had needed him to reach. I folded my hands on the table. I also owe you truth, I said. My service cost you things. I missed days that mattered. I sometimes treated endurance as if it were the same as attention. When you were young, I expected you to understand decisions adults barely understood. His eyes lowered. But none of that made me a fake soldier. None of it gave you my rank, my money, my name, or my mind. I know. Knowing is not repair. What is? Restitution. Consistency. No pressure on Anna. No request for access to my accounts or the foundation. No public story in which you become the victim of my boundaries. He nodded. Do you forgive me? I may. Some days I already do. Hope rose in his face too quickly. I continued. Forgiveness is not a key back into my house. He looked down again. This time he did not argue. We began with letters once a month, then short telephone calls. Trust did not return because he cried, served time, or said the correct words. It returned in pieces when he made payments without reminders, respected Anna's choices, corrected people who repeated his old version, and accepted that some family events would occur without him. Repair through action is slow. That is why it counts. The following Veterans Day, I returned to the same memorial hall. The kitchen doors still swung open and closed. The same flag stood behind the stage. Thomas's portrait rested beside the podium, but this time my full-service biography appeared in the printed program. My place card read Colonel Evelyn Mercer, United States Army, retired. It sat at the front table beside Anna. Before the ceremony, General Green asked whether I wanted him to introduce me by rank. Yes, I said. Tonight, use it correctly. Anna had spent the summer helping the archive record a second oral history, mine. She did not ask only about medals or danger. She asked about night shifts, command failures, patients I remembered, choices I regretted, and what it felt like to come home when everyone expected home to make a person whole. Those were better questions. During the program, a young nursing student received the first Quiet Service Scholarship. She was 53 years old, the widow of a Navy mechanic, returning to school after raising 3 children. When she crossed the stage, her hands trembled. I recognized that kind of courage. Afterward, Anna and I stood in the lobby between Thomas's helmet and my jacket. The silver eagle on the shoulder caught the light. Anna reached up and straightened the edge of the display card. Grandpa made noise, she said. He certainly did. You did not. Not as much. She slipped her arm through mine. People should have listened anyway. I looked at the 2 uniforms, the uncropped photograph, and the granddaughter, who now knew the difference between silence and absence. Respect should not have required witnesses, I said. But once the truth had witnesses, no one could make me small again. The Silver Eagle did not give me dignity. It only made it impossible for them to keep pretending I had never earned my own.